So today we're going to start by looking at the first of the categories in the trauma-informed mindfulness model, which is the characteristics. And there are 7 of those. So we'll start by looking at the first of them, which is to have a little bit of psychological trauma knowledge. So that's going to help us with our trauma-informed practice if we know a little bit about what's going on in the brain and how that's affecting the body. So this video is going to cover this first part, which is to look at the autonomic nervous system and how that manages homeostasis. So if I go to the first slide in this presentation, we've got a kind of seesaw in our body, which is where the autonomic nervous system is balancing the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of that nervous system, trying to keep them in what's called homeostasis. And if we look in more detail at the sympathetic side of that nervous system, the sympathetic side is also known as the fight or flight response. And that's when we perceive something to be dangerous or risky, and our body goes into a state of high alert. And once we're in a state of high alert, we'll notice that our body is feeling very tense, our heart rate is fast, breathing is shallow and irregular. It's likely that our mind is going to be racing and it's difficult to concentrate. Our emotions are anxious, fearful. We might feel overwhelmed and stressed. Our spirit is unsettled and agitated, and as a result of that, our relationships are likely to be tense and strained. On the other hand, once we're in sort of control of the parasympathetic nervous system, if you like, that's also known as the rest and digest system, which is when we think that the danger is past, we're not at risk anymore, and our body goes into more of a relaxation mode. And the reason I put a little parachute on there for you is to remember that the parachute is the parasympathetic, which is what calms us down. And when we're in that kind of relaxed rest and digest state, our body feels calm and our heart rate is slow and steady, breathing is deep and even. Minds aren't overthinking and they're able to focus and concentrate. We feel quite settled in our emotions. Our spirit is peaceful and our relationships are a lot more harmonious and connected and enjoyable when we're in that calm state of being. And if you just have a look in your workbook, you'll see that there's a little bit more information there and space for notes. And the continuum that you see across the middle of the page is an illustration of the fact that these things happen to us because of how we perceive our environment to be. So it's not just that there is something to be afraid of that is dangerous in the environment, but if we perceive it to be, then our sympathetic nervous system is going to be activated. That fight-flight response will be triggered. Now, inside the brain, we have 3 parts of the brain. That's why it's called the triune brain. The brown part on this diagram is the reptilian brain. It's called that because it's the oldest part of our brain. It's mainly automatic and controls things like our heart rate and breathing and temperature. The middle part of the brain is the limbic system in red, which is largely to do with our emotions and emotional memories. And the neocortex is the blue part that wraps over the whole of the top of the brain, and particularly the front part of our brain is to do with executive functioning and concentration and reasoning, those kinds of activities. And those are the kinds of things that don't operate very well when we're in fight or flight mode. Right inside the limbic system, which is the little red part on the previous slide, we have 2 parts that are quite relevant to understanding how trauma affects the brain. The little yellow dots are the amygdala, which act as an alarm when we perceive that we're under threat or in danger. And the hippocampus is sometimes called the library or the storage area, which is where, generally speaking, it's thought that our memories are stored away, but they're stored away in such a way usually that we can recall them at a future date. Sometimes people say that they're kind of date stamped and they're put in order so that we know where to find them at a later date. Now, the way that trauma affects the brain is that it overactivates the amygdala and the fear response becomes more intense. In other words, all of the sensory information, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, everything is overloading the amygdala. and it isn't able to send information through to the hippocampus in an orderly fashion, and so the memories become kind of quite jumbly and are mainly emotionally and sensorily laden. So the other part that was useful for us to know in terms of how the body is affected by trauma is to just look at the HPA axis, and it's called that because it stands for hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal cortex, and these three parts work together in our trauma response system in the body. So the way that that operates is detailed a bit more in your workbook. So you've got a picture there of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and that shows how they work in conjunction with each other. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called CRH to the pituitary gland just below it, and the pituitary gland releases a hormone called ACTH, which then trickles all the way down into the adrenal glands at the top of the kidneys. And once the adrenal glands are activated, that's where we get the hormones that are responsible for that fight-flight response, which are adrenaline and cortisol, which you're very likely to have heard of before. Okay, so that's our quick overview of what's going on in the body and the brain in a fight-flight trauma response. And the next video, we'll have a look a little bit more at the DSM.